Reality's finally been acknowledged. Blizzard just killed Overwatch 2. And they really had to, because by killing the two, they can now make sure the Overwatch they have can thrive. And now, as the 10th anniversary of the original game's launch approaches, yes, it really has been a decade, Blizzard's devs are trying to recapture the energy and the charm that made Overwatch matter in the first place. And do you know what's kind of interesting? It seems it's kind of working, because as of this week, their relaunch has just went live and it's already pulling 165,000 concurrent players on just Steam. Now, you gotta remember, broadly, Steam is seen to be a fraction of the overall Battle.net audience, at least for Overwatch, because, well, Overwatch had always lived in BNet. Now, to put just the Steam numbers in perspective, it's currently trading blows with Marvel Rivals, so fairly big, and this is all for a game that people were writing obituaries for 2 years ago. So today, we're gonna see what they're changing, how we got here, what it means for the future. And I don't know about you, but, well, I think we've all seen the very funny same-face memes going around on Twitter. There's a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. A year ago, we talked about Overwatch 2 launching again, and it really was like that. The 2025 Spotlight brought a whole new pillar of development with the kind of Counter-Strike-like stadium system. They had core system changes with perks to all heroes, and a new reason to play by reintroducing loot boxes, but, you know, not paid ones. And this was all built on the work that they had done, re-adding 6v6 back into the game as an option, along with a bunch of other long-requested things. And that all kicked off right as the hero shooter saw a resurgence, of course, in the form of Marvel Rivals. And I think with how things are going, we can say that competition is only a good thing. Now, Overwatch's changes back then were in development way before Rivals was a thing, and whenever Rivals was first revealed, people clowned on it for basically looking like a cheap knockoff of Overwatch. It's quite funny how times have changed. Rivals proved people actually wanted a hero shooter and would play it, and that meant that they had to start taking risks to finally be relevant again. Especially because they could also relaunch the game on Battle.net in China. That's a region that had been starved of Overwatch 2 to the point that the Steam release of Overwatch 2 has 2/3 of its negative reviews being Chinese players who lost access to the game. But for the last 12 months, up until this point, what we've seen is Overwatch players broadly having a positive sentiment to the game. There still were quibbles with the game, but the foundation seemed solid. It seems the development team actually started to have consistency, and it's with all of that in mind that we lose the 2 and rebrand Overwatch. Overwatch has lost the 2, and they're definitely framing it as a new Overwatch because it's now starting with Season 1. And it's out right now. Now, the team aren't saying that it's a relaunch, but honestly, it's hard to not see this as a relaunch. There are 5 new characters in the first season, that's 2 more than Overwatch 2's launch, and 5 more will come throughout the year. Now, one of those is the delivery of the Jetpack Cat. That's a character that existed in the original Overwatch concept art, though it existed as a sort of art test to see how far they could push things. Now they've resurrected it. On top of that, though, we've got a whole new perk system for hero subclasses, a UI overhaul, including the return of end-around votes, an engine overhaul later on in the year, and quite a lot of other things. And all this is, as it turns out, just the start. Now, it all kicked off with a new character-driven cinematic that advances the game narratively, and I think this is big. So what they're doing is they're starting a year-long story arc that will develop across 6 seasons. PvE, this is not. But what it should mean is that the Overwatch IP will finally start moving again. And it's all happening alongside regular map and mode improvements, plus hero reworks and competitive events. And since launch, the numbers back it up. There's 165,000 concurrent players. That's the highest the game has ever reached on Steam. And again, that's only a fraction of whatever Battle.net is. Maybe that's not as imbalanced as it used to be. Maybe most of the people returning to the game are doing so on Steam. But still, even only on Steam, it is directly competing with Marvel Rivals. And that's a game that was eating Overwatch's lunch just months ago. I mean, it really was pretty bad. Overwatch was sitting there at like the low 30Ks, all while Marvel Rivals was well over 100 for a lot of the time. So, the response from lapsed players seems to feel energized. And I'd say it feels energized in a way that the 2025 Spotlight, Stadium, and all of that stuff just didn't quite manage. So people are back, and to understand why this is landing differently, you got to understand what Overwatch was actually supposed to be. By that I mean Overwatch 1, Overwatch 2, and I guess now, Overwatch 1 again. When Overwatch launched in 2016, it did so under the legacy of a failed MMORPG called Project Titan. It was a game that was intended to reach far beyond Blizzard's existing audience and capture them with, I guess, the optimistic kind of hero-y future storytelling stuff. And you know what? It actually did succeed. People made jokes about the impact of certain Blender animations, certain things done in Source Filmmaker as the reason for Overwatch's reach, but that was really just a symptom. It was all about the characters, the lore cinematics, the story around the game. Obviously, not really much story in the game, but that worked for people, and it built Overwatch into the sort of IP that felt larger than it actually was within the game. That really worked. But as time went on, things changed. The relatively freeform gameplay of the launch was increasingly being squeezed through the lens of esports balancing. Of course, we all know that the big man, Bobby, wanted this to be like a massive esports league. He just wanted it to be the gamer NFL, which did not happen. But we also saw that story content stopped turning up as much in-game over the years. Now, Overwatch 2 then rolled around at BlizzCon, and it was pitched as the PvE game that would re-establish all that narrative stuff. But obviously it didn't, and we'll come back to that. But now, after the comparative disaster of the Invasion season, with its overpriced PvE content, we found Blizzard finally able to deliver Overwatch narrative to people while they play. It's absolutely not in the form that people wanted, in that it's not PvE, but I think this is probably the best that they can do. And they're even going to let players influence what happens, which I thought to be quite neat. But obviously, it's not going back to PvE. Instead, what they're doing is weaving the narrative through the Overwatch that people are already playing. There's a 5-week meta event that's going to let players pick a side in the whole Overwatch versus Talon conflict thing, which of course will lead to challenges and rewards. But here's where it's interesting, because according to Aaron Keller, who's the game director, the maps will actually update in-game depending on who wins. So basically, in-game consequences for the actions of players. That's something that Overwatch has never really had. And we've seen just how much that kind of thing can mean. If you take a look at, say, the surges around Helldivers 2, so much of that is the devs doing relatively small things, but things that make players feel like they're part of the ongoing story. That's been one of the best arguments for a live service game actually earning being a live service. And if they actually nail this, then I think Overwatch will begin to make sense as a live service. You know, the live service actually being the game that you're playing and how it evolves, not just the way that the damn thing is monetized. Though, you best believe this is all going to be monetized and there will be mythic skins up the wazoo. Now, this all connects to the other big shift, and that's 5 heroes launching at once, and then another hero every season for a year. That's a shitload, and it goes directly against one of the larger complaints about what Overwatch has evolved into. A game that has to be perfectly balanced, because the changes were driven by competitive player complaints. Obviously, in Marvel Rivals land, they're just throwing in heroes all the time, and people just kind of like that. So with this launch, they're doing something similar. They're throwing everything at the wall. And maybe that is inspired by how people have liked it in Marvel Rivals. But it's also coming with a confidence. And I think that confidence is beginning to feel credible to people. Because look, if it didn't feel credible, you wouldn't have seen player action over on Steam. And where it's interesting is it seems that it's in the last year that they found that confidence, which is absolutely later than it should have been. But when we think about how much of a disaster Overwatch 2 was, I think it makes sense that it took this long. To state the obvious, Overwatch 2's launch was not the game people thought they would be getting, but it was also not the game that the developers wanted to make. You see, when it was announced in 2019, Overwatch 2 was supposed to be a PvE sequel to the first game, and one that would exist in parallel to it, offering a different experience. But obviously it entered sheer development hell. The team just couldn't make their PvE vision work, the C-suite wanted something to sell, the project faltered, and we saw the original leadership like Jeff Kaplan leave the company, and the people who were left to steer the ship were effectively having to cobble together, within a year of development time, a game from the functioning PvP aspects of Overwatch 2. It was a shit show. They were left with a bunch of random pieces, and they cobbled that into a game so that at least Overwatch would exist in a form that could be updated. You know, because by that stage, Overwatch 1 was sort of abandoned. Of course, when the game launched, didn't really work out that well, did it? So October 2022 saw the early access release that replaced the game that people already liked, so that was it for Overwatch 1. The full release in August 2023 also was not better, even though they really tried to frame it as being better. And that's just because nothing came together. Like, Overwatch 2 finally at that point had the PvE that had been promised, but the invasion missions were, to put it lightly, rather thin. And then came the layoffs, the Overwatch League development teams in 2023, and then the entire PvE and story team in 2024. Yeah, they all just got yoked. And then in May 2025, the 200-strong Overwatch team unionized. So by that point, right, we have 3 years of shipping someone else's failed vision, 2 rounds of layoffs, and a community that held them responsible for a game that they had inherited, and a bunch of decisions made by higher-ups who, well, at least in the case of Mr. Kotick, they very much didn't respect. In many ways then, 2025 is really the first year that the Overwatch team has been able to take a breath and stabilize, which, as much as that may seem like it's me gassing them up, I still do need to be clear. That's too damn long, and none of this should have happened the way that it did. Now, in a way, it's also the year that the game finally began to find its feet. And all of that explains what's been happening behind the scenes, and the idea that the people currently building Overwatch are no longer wanting to pay for the sins of leadership who have since moved on. Jeff Kaplan's Overwatch 2 is dead. Bobby Kotick's Overwatch 2 is dead. And what we're going to get now has finally got enough distance from all that bullshit to at least be its own thing. But the question is whether they can get past the damage that the sequel's launch did to players. And I think that for many, it's going to be a tough sell. The grievances make sense when you realize it's a decade since Overwatch came out and nearly 4 years since Overwatch 2. That's a lot of time for grievances to build up, and rightly so. And for so many, the sequel was something that took the game they paid away and replaced it with a new business model in a game that they didn't really want. And if you bounced off Overwatch 2, you may still think that 6v6 isn't a thing, that the relaunch was a cash grab that asked for money instead of playtime for cosmetics, unlike the original. There are people who will just never play Overwatch again because they were promised something by execs and it was never delivered. And Overwatch's optimistic, energetic world, I think, made all the controversy that engulfed Blizzard hit even harder, because it was the opposite of the art they were trying to make. So when they heard about abuse or couldn't abide the actions of Microsoft, it was all just confirmation that they made the right choice to not give a shit anymore. Of course, the people making Overwatch cannot change any of those things. But at least what they can do, and what they seem to be doing, is to stop trying to, right? The PvE game we were sold is gone. A half-hearted version of it, like Invasion, was just a non-starter, and when it came out, it was obviously disappointing. And the team tasked with making it, and PvE in general, are all gone. You can't undo those things. You can't gain that knowledge that's been lost. But what's left is a team that I think have finally been able to stabilize and are now pushing Overwatch forward again. That's why I think weaving narrative through these seasons is actually key to the Overwatch franchise. You see, in the past, to me, it all felt like live service slop. Because one month it would be the fantasy D&D 5th edition theme. The next month it would be the spooky theme. The next season it would be some other theme. Look, there's a Porsche in the game, and another brand collab, and a Gundam. And it all just felt like slop. Now, I know those brand collabs are still going to happen. They still make me eye roll as much as they always have. But if there's a story that's unfolding over time, a thing for people to track, to keep up to date with, I think that means that Overwatch will exist in their minds in a way that is more than just a bunch of arena shooter maps that you can play whilst you have paid consumption opportunities marketed toward you. And if Overwatch is ever going to have a future, well, that's exactly what it needs to start doing. The one thing I haven't covered in this video is same-face syndrome with all of those characters. Oh my god, the things on Twitter are so damn funny, swapping over the hairstyles, and it's just like, yeah, is the reason why they can do so many characters now because they just, you know, farm out a bunch of Kirikos and then put different hair on them? Who knows? They have actually confirmed that one of those characters is going to have her face changed. And I guess doing a big dummy mummy, literally called Domina, that's sure to get segments of the internet thinking about Overwatch again, isn't it? Okay, that's it for this video. So often we cover shit shows and disasters, and as much as the same face syndrome is really quite funny, I don't think that this is a disaster. I think this is a team doing the best that they can do. If what they're now making isn't something you want, I totally get that. Honestly, it's not particularly something that I want personally. But if there's a version of Overwatch that's better than the one that we currently have, and the development team has a better way of making the game, and the IP is able to grow and people enjoy that, then that certainly is a good thing, because it's more people getting a video game that they enjoy, which I should probably, remind everyone, is actually a good thing. But you know what's not a good thing? Windows. Sadly, Windows is the thing that Overwatch runs on. But if you want to see all the spicy stuff going on with Windows, and Microsoft basically admitting they know they've totally fucked it, watch this video next.